it's a strange time to begin studying with a global crisis, huge unemployment, rapidly changing workforce, a complete standstill of global trade, all kinds of jobs disappearing and new jobs beginning to appear. In some ways, you might think there's never been a worse time to plan for your future because the future is so uncertain.
Why would you study at this time when there's more pressing matters to worry about, like family getting sick, like you losing your job and having to get another job to provide for your family, or to just keep your household going, pay the bills? It does seem like a strange time to choose to start a new course of study. I agree.
Over half a century ago, C.S. Lewis, the great English novelist and theologian, preached a sermon at Oxford University. Lewis was a teacher of literature at Oxford, and 1 month after after England declared war on Germany, October 1939, Lewis preached in the university chapel to undergraduate students at Oxford. If today seems like a dodgy time to be planning for the future, October 1939 was far worse. Most of these students were young people who knew that they might be conscripted at any moment into military service. They had begun a degree that would take 2 or 3 or 4 years, and they had no certainty at all.
And they'd only just begun as well. We're talking about autumn in the Northern Hemisphere. And so, and their academic year starts in September typically. And so they'd really only just started, and they would really be wondering. I mean, there's more than anyone here today would be wondering. Their friends are going off to war. Their families going off to war. There's mass armament. People are being redirected into factories to make planes and bombs and all kinds of things. And then all of these people are going off to beautiful Oxford to study Anglo-Saxon poetry and chemistry and all kinds of things that don't seem very relevant at that point. So that's the context for this sermon, isn't it?
And so Lewis takes this as his theme and says, why study now? Why begin something in the midst of a global crisis? Why begin something at a point in history in which the future is very, very uncertain?
And he in this sermon he gives he gives one big answer, but within that answer he has a couple of different aspects. One is that is to do with human nature and human culture, and the other is to do with the other big answer is to do with the Christian vocation of being a scholar and of studying.
The first argument that to do with human nature, it's partly about mortality, right? It's the fact that when a global crisis like this happens, we suddenly feel that our lives are vulnerable. We suddenly discover our own fragility. I'd been buying and selling, enjoying my job, enjoying time with family and friends, as if it would all last forever. And suddenly there's a global crisis, and I realize that my life is temporary, that the things that I've invested myself in are temporary, that the joys and pleasures of life are temporary. That discovery it can be a shocking one, but it's not as if, Lewis says, it's not as if the war has created this completely new situation, right? Suddenly life has become temporary.
It's always been like that. And he points out, in fact, a really interesting parallel, particularly for Christians who are studying, is that, well, why study chemistry or Anglo-Saxon or music when there are people out there who need to hear the gospel and who need to be saved from eternal damnation? Why do something so temporarily focused? So that he gives a kind of a explicit parallel in the life of the Christian as well there. It's not just about human culture. It's actually about Christian. As a Christian, why would you do this when there seems to be something so much more pressing and eternal for us to be doing?
What's the answer to that?
Well, the first answer he gives, and I've hinted at that already, is that he says, in short, that study and scholarship is a human activity, and it's something that's always been done and always will be done. He says this really nicely when he points out that it's not whether you'll read books, it's whether you'll read good books or bad books. Everyone's going to read books. Everyone's going to study something. It's whether you do it well or you do it poorly. And I think that's a nice illustration of how how studying anything is just a permanent situation for pretty well every human being. Not that everyone goes to university. In fact, in history, we're a really privileged generation where the majority of people in this country end up going to university at some point. So the point isn't that everyone's doing this highfalutin study. His point is that everyone is engaged in a cultural activity of learning at some level. The question is, will it be a good one, a good activity, or a bad activity?
The war, the situation in 1939, meant that there was a huge. One of the effects he talks about was a huge sense of distraction. Every waking thought, you're tempted to think about nothing but the global crisis. What's happening today? Keeping up with the news. What's going to happen tomorrow?
And I've certainly felt that pull at this time. I'm checking the news quite regularly across the day about what are the updates with COVID-19, what's the government announcing, and I'm getting quite distracted from. I'm sorry to say, Ben's my dean, my academic dean, but I get distracted from my work, just trying to make sure I'm on top of what's happening with the situation. And it does distract you from your work. You worry about it. You think about you're thinking about the problems that seem bigger and more pressing, and so it's definitely a temptation for all of us today as well.
And Lewis has a quite beautiful response to this. He points out that yes, the world is changing rapidly, and it's easy to be distracted by that. It's easy to be absorbed in those things. But it's not as if this is a totally unique situation. Let's say, well, we're just going to wait until the world becomes normal again. It's interesting how with COVID-19 we use that word of when things return to normal. And in 1939, they were already talking the same way again. And Lewis puts it in quote marks and says, well, there's never actually been a normal time.
That's right.
There's always some kind of crisis in life. There's always something ready to distract you. If you wait, in other words, for the optimal time to begin study, if you wait for the optimal time to embark on a new adventure in life, if you wait for the optimal time, what happens? It never comes. Life is not like that. So in the midst of the current situation, the problem gets aggravated. Our tendency to be absorbed by other things, to have our attention pulled away from the things that really matter for our lives, that it gets aggravated. But it's the same situation for all of us. And Lewis points out, look at the great cathedrals and the great works of art and people who built hospitals and great institutions. These people were always living through periods of crisis, and they decided that it may not be the optimal time to do this work, but it's the right time for me. I'm called to do it now anyway.
Let me read out what he says. So this is from the sermon is now known as Learning in Wartime. And this is what he says toward the end of the sermon. He says, there are always plenty of rivals to our work. We are always falling in love or quarrelling, looking for jobs or fearing to lose them, getting ill and recovering, following public affairs. If we let ourselves, we shall always be waiting for some distraction or other to end before we can really get down to our work. And then he says, favourable conditions never come. There are, of course, moments when the pressure of the excitement is so great that only superhuman self-control could resist it. And then he says, they come both in war and in peace. We must do the best we can. And basically he's saying, it doesn't really matter whether we're in a crisis or in a time which seems, in inverted commas, normal. The point is we need to get down to our work. And in the case of the people who Lewis is talking to, that work is the work of study and of learning.
You can see sort of beneath the surface here is C.S. Lewis's understanding of vocation or calling. A vocation literally means, it's from a Latin word that means to be called, to hear something, to respond to it. What does it mean for our lives to have a vocation? Lewis doesn't think it means that I have necessarily, this may have happened, but I haven't necessarily heard an audible voice where God has told me this is what you should do next. Most of the time in our lives, life kind of happens to us. I find myself thrust into a new situation. that I hadn't necessarily planned on. I hadn't necessarily anticipated. What do I do right now? Right here in the midst of my life, Lewis argues, is an opportunity to find what God is saying to me and to try to respond. He talks about he talks about university life as a road that you can travel to meet God. That's what it means to have a vocation. I might be, if I'm one of the people lucky enough to have a job in a world where so many millions have lost their jobs, my job is a road that I can walk seeking God. My job is a road on which God is waiting to meet me. If I've got children who are forced to stay at home from school and I am thrust into a completely new situation of trying to maintain their education at home, that can be a frustrating or disconcerting experience. It can also be a road on which God is waiting to meet me, a vocation. If I've chosen to embark on a new period of study and learning, even if the times are unfavorable, even if the future is uncertain, that course of study, Lewis thinks, can be a vocation. It can be a word that God is speaking to me, an opportunity to respond, a road that I can walk as I seek to find God.
He says in the sermon, and he uses this word merely he doesn't actually think it's merely natural. All our merely natural activities will be accepted. He's contrasting natural activities to spiritual activities here. All our merely natural activities will be accepted if they are offered to God, even the humblest. And all of them, even the noblest, will be sinful if they are not. So even if what he's saying is, even if we're the best scholar in the whole world, even if we're the leading scholar in English literature or in history or in biology, if it's not offered to God, it won't be. If it's not offered to God, it will be sinful. It won't be pleasing to Him. But even the person who pursues a calling of whether it's some scholarship, which is sometimes painted as a higher calling or learning, or whether it's running a grocery store or driving a taxi or whatever it is, all of those callings are legitimate callings and pleasing to God if they are offered up to Him.
Making the children breakfast in the morning.
That's one of the best things you can do.
This is a road on which God is waiting to meet me.
And why is that the calling that God's put in our lives? Because that's where we are at that time.
Yeah, and this is what Lewis is talking about. Not necessarily seeking to hear a special message. If it comes, and that's wonderful. But the main thing we have to do is acclimatize ourselves somehow to life as it actually is. Life right now, if you're in a period of wartime or a period of coronavirus or a period of rapid social change, this is the one precious life God has given me. And there is an opportunity to find what God is saying to me, to live as if I am living for God's glory in the midst of an imperfect world, in the midst of unfavorable times.
Yeah, exactly. And so he talks about as well about the dangers of the life of learning too, and he talks about how that could be there are dangers. People can become prideful because they're growing in knowledge, and that's certainly a theme that's in the Bible. It's knowledge puffs up. There's a warning in the Bible about that as well. But we're also called to pursue knowledge in the book of Proverbs. Knowledge is a good thing if we pursue it in line with our personal calling and our vocation as Christians. And we channel it toward God, which is what Lewis is calling us to do in this sermon, then it's not as much of a danger. So the question then
or rather, you could say it's a dangerous journey that's worth it.
Yeah, that's right.
Still dangerous, but it's worth the risk.
Yeah.
Any worthwhile journey has danger.
Right.
Any worthwhile occupation. I went out riding my bicycle on the road for hours this morning. Dangerous, but worth it.
Sure.
The life of study, yes, comes with certain risks, but if you live for the glory of God, if you seek in all your knowledge to attain what the Bible calls the fear of the Lord, that's what humbles you. That's what keeps you on the right path. That's what turns study into a path to God, into a vocation.
A question I had reading Lewis's sermon is when he talks about studying or pursuing the beautiful and the beauty and truth for their own sake. What do you think he means by that? And how to reconcile that with the Christian calling to be studying and learning. From what I understand, he's saying, I think that he sees beauty and truth as things that are not separate to God, not something that can be pursued above God or besides God. Although, non-Christians and non-believers pursue truth just as well, if not better, than Christians do a lot of the time. So it's not like Christianity has a monopoly on pursuing truth in the sense of scholarship and study. But how would you explain what he means by pursuing beauty and pursuing truth for themselves?
If you think of study, it's a great question. If you think of study, imagine I've got an assignment to write. To pursue truth as an end in itself, I think means to be completely present in the work that I'm doing. I'm not just doing it to attain some future goal.
Right.
I'm not just doing it for a reward, though I hope to be rewarded by a great mark and glowing comments on the paper. But as I become absorbed in my work, there's this concept of the flow that has been used by some sociologists to talk about people who are highly skilled at their work sometimes can get into such a flow that it's as if it's just happening naturally. It's as if you're just pouring your thoughts into this assignment or into the sport that you're playing or the music that you're performing or whatever. When you become completely attentive, completely present in this present moment, lovingly giving yourself over to the work that you're doing. In a weird way, you're not necessarily thinking every second, I am doing this for God's glory.
Yes.
You're just thinking, I want this to be as good as it can be. You're finding intrinsic joy in the work that you're doing. And in a strange way, that brings glory to God. I don't know if you know the much quoted line, maybe this is a cliche to refer to this, but there's a much quoted line by the runner, Eric Liddell, who said, when I run, I feel God's pleasure. It's not that as I put every step forward, I'm trying to glorify God. I'm just trying to run. Why? Because that is the life God has given me, in his case. That's the life God has given me. I find such intrinsic joy in this that I feel God's pleasure. I'm actually giving God glory, not directly by trying to, but by fully responding, by fully saying yes to the life that God has given me, to the work that God has given me.
Eric Liddell was running for the sake of running.
Yeah. And just by doing that, he runs for the sake of God's glory and brings God pleasure.
This is the point you've just raised is related to Lewis's second, what he calls an enemy of pursuing the learning vocation, and that is what he calls frustration. That is that the feeling that we won't have time to finish, that the future beckons, and that time is always pressing in on us. What he says, though, is that as Christians, we should leave the future in God's hands. That we may as well, for God will certainly retain it, whether we leave it to him or not. It's always in his hands. We actually can't do anything about that. And so
we discover how uncertain the future is when there's a global catastrophe like this, right? But the future was already uncertain.
Yeah,
always.
It's not
no one knows what tomorrow.
It's not especially uncertain now.
Yeah,
it's just that we realize it so acutely.
We've suddenly become aware that the future is in God's hands, not ours. We've suddenly become aware that the plans that we make are always provisional and fragile and vulnerable. That we don't control the future.
And so Lewis has this. Again, I'm going to refer to the sermon here because I think it's so helpful, where he says, never in peace or war commit your virtue or your happiness to the future. Happy work, and by that I think he doesn't just mean happy like we feel kind of cheerful about it, although he does mean that, but he actually also, I think he also means good work. Happy work is
fulfilling work that nourishes the soul. Yes.
Exactly. That kind of work is best done by the man who takes his long-term plans somewhat lightly and works from moment to moment, and that speaks to that feeling that you get when you are engrossed in your work and you feel like you couldn't think about anything else at that moment. You've just been writing that essay, you've been reading that book, you've been running, you've been whatever it might be.
There's an obvious tension here, right? The reason people would sign up to study at any period is to attain some future good that they're seeking. There'll be people who are seeking a new career path. There'll be people who are seeking to acquire skills that will make them more employable in increasingly challenging economic conditions. There are people who would have been planning for years to embark on some new study as part of a journey of personal exploration and transformation. We commit to study to attain something in the future, work or personal transformation or the ability to impact the world in some way. Lewis is aware of that, but he's trying to bring that into tension with this other thing that you're talking about, that because we never know anyway what the future holds. Yes, we can have plans, but we hold them lightly. Or even better, we accept that God is the keeper of those plans. God will hold them.
Yeah.
The life that God gives me to live doesn't exist in some future time. If you think about it, the future never comes, right? I wake up tomorrow. Oh, it's the present again.
Always the present.
It's always the present. And the only place where God comes to meet me is in the present. The only place where there is a vocation for me is not in some future life,
right,
where I've got my degree and I'm better prepared and then I'll have a vocation. The only place in which God is calling to me, speaking to me, summoning me is the present. So although I'm preparing for the future by study, there's an opportunity, a big opportunity, to turn the study itself into that road that I will walk as I seek God. Finding happiness in the work, I don't think means that you always feel this overwhelming sense of joy and spontaneous flow as you write every essay and read every textbook. But if you're able to work in a way that is not just anchored in the future, but somehow anchored in the present, there are present rewards to be earned right now by devoting my attention to this. I think that's what Lewis is talking about.
There's a third enemy of study and learning, which Lewis points out, and that is the enemy of fear. And in Lewis's context, that was the fear of, again, it was related to the future, but it's the fear of death. Now thankfully in our current context, that fear of death with COVID-19 in Australia seems to have been minimised and brought under control. But it is still an uncertainty, isn't it? We don't know exactly what will happen with this virus. We don't know what will happen in our lives. We don't know when we're going to die. Without focusing on morbidity too much, this is not I guess Lewis's point here is that actually everyone does eventually die. There's a 100% death rate in the human race.
And there's a shocking statement where he says, actually, he says the war hasn't increased the likelihood of dying. Everyone is 100% likely to die. This is part of what it means to have an uncertain future, right? I don't know how long I will live for. I don't know whether I will get to finish the work that I start. Think of those young men studying in Oxford in 1939. Many of them already are having friends being conscripted into military service. They're literally beginning something with no certainty, no guarantees at all about whether they'll be able to finish it or how long they will live. Perhaps a bit shockingly, if Lewis ever seems a bit insensitive too, by the way, he himself had fought in the trenches of the First War, and he knew from experience what it means to live on the brink of eternity. And strangely, he knew how normal life is, even on the brink of eternity. What you end up doing is, he says, the closer you actually got to the trenches in the First War, the closer you got to the action, the less you thought about the war. You were reading, you were playing cards, you were talking about family. Life goes on in any circumstances, and we find ourselves living the life God has given us wherever we are. But there's a seemingly insensitive statement about the fear of death, where he says, actually, Christians would regard the fact that in a wartime, in a global emergency, we suddenly become aware of how vulnerable we are. We suddenly become aware of how fragile the gift of our lives are. is. We suddenly become aware of our own mortality. He says that's one of the blessings of war. War's a bad thing, but one of the good things it can do for you, he says, is to remind you of the kind of universe you've been living in all along. Your future has always been in God's hands.
So what does this mean for someone who's coming to consider study?
What do you think?
Well, I wonder if it actually doesn't change anything, because nothing's different. That's what Lewis is pointing out, that this is not an extraordinary circumstance in the greater scheme of things. So pursuing study in light of the 100% death rate in humanity, it actually doesn't really make any difference. It's still a legitimate and good calling for you. It's still a legitimate and good calling for me and for others. The acuteness of the acute awareness that we have at the moment of death doesn't change whether study and learning is a good path to take. To bring us home, I think it'd be good for us to consider, how does the pursuit of knowledge and learning relate to our relationship to God and to the pursuit of knowing God?
Can I throw in one more quote just before we do that?
Probably
the German Protestant reformer Martin Luther was once asked the question, if you knew the world was going to end tomorrow, what would you do? Do you know what he said? I would plant a tree. That is a Christian way of thinking about the future. In other words, I never know what the future holds. That's up to God. What I do know is what God calls me to do today. I plant a tree. I would go on investing in the future of the world, even if I knew it was ending tomorrow. That's what Luther says. We're not in a situation where the world is ending tomorrow. We're just in a situation where we are more aware of the uncertainty of the future. What kind of world will we be living in a year from now or 2 years from now? What do? Plant a tree, plant a seed, begin a new project, fall in love, get a degree, live. That's the message.
And this is one of the great things about Lewis's thought, is his thought is always supremely humane, in the sense that it's very human. It helps us to realize what it means to be a normal human being, and how special that is as well. And that's I think what you're illustrating, that human pursuits aren't meaningless just because the world's going to end one day. There's always more, as Christians in particular, that we should do to just invest in life in God's world. One of the tensions, though, of course, in the Christian life, and this is worth considering for those who are non-believers as well as believers who are watching, is how does this relate to our pursuit to the eternal things, to the things to spirituality, to the pursuit of God. Lewis has an answer here where he actually says that the life of learning is actually one way that we can grow closer to God. And he discusses it in the context of growing as a person, but also it is a spiritual activity in its own way, right?
In what way would you say it's a spiritual activity? I mean, I can think of it like this, that studying anything, learning anything is a way of being humbled. It's a way of opening myself up to, I write down the answers as I see them. They're not all right. And that's a humbling experience where I realize there's something out there that's bigger than me, that's bigger than my preconceptions, and I have to adapt myself to that. I'm learning now to sort of open my mind and potentially to open my heart to a bigger world. I think that can be a way of acclimatizing myself to God, who is always greater than my preconceptions, who is always more. What else do you think? In what way can study be a spiritual calling or a means of spiritual growth?
I think something that Lewis says that's really helpful is there's two things that I think are worth drawing out in particular here. One is that as in the pursuit of truth and knowledge and beauty, when we pursue those things faithfully and for their own ends as well as for the glory of God, we actually advance in some way our own knowledge of God and knowledge of God that others might have as well. If we uncover truth about God's world or God himself, then we are helping ourselves know him better and others to know him better. The second thing that he says, and I'm just going to try and find it. I had it just here. He says here, we can therefore pursue knowledge as such and beauty as such in the sure confidence that by doing so we are either advancing to the vision of God ourselves or indirectly helping others to do so. And so I think that's a really rich motivation for Christians to pursue scholarship and study, because as we study, we can study confident in the knowledge that this is a world that's been created by a God who is orderly. It's an orderly world. It's a world that has things that we can learn about. It's made by an unchangeable God who actually wants us to know him, and he made the world in part so that we would know him.
Can I draw out just one more thing from this sermon by C.S. Lewis? And we've touched on this already, but the way Lewis really places ordinary human life right at the center is incredibly important. It's easy to think as if what God's interested in is the spiritual side of me, the side of me that prays and goes to church and has
quiet times.
Yeah. As if that's think of that 1 hour in church on Sunday, or 3 hours if you go to Pentecostal church like I used to as a kid. That fragment of time, as if that's the part of me God's interested in. No, Lewis thinks God is my creator, and the whole life, the whole bag of bones and cells and mind and spirit that makes me who I am, all of that is what God is interested in. And because so there's many legitimate ways to live, but if God is calling you into a life of study, a period of learning, a period of personal growth and transformation, just the mere fact that you are doing those things, that you give yourself over to that work, becomes, again, it's like Eric Liddell saying that I feel God's pleasure. God is pleased with our creatureliness. God is pleased with our humanness. God doesn't just want a special spiritual bits of our life, and important as they are. God wants the whole of our human life. And one of the ways that we can direct our lives towards God's glory, Lewis thinks, towards God's pleasure, God's own joy, is by finding and taking joy in the life that we have. Not always waiting for a better life, not always waiting for a better world. I'm alive here and now. I've got work to do here and now. And I work feeling God's pleasure, feeling God's joy, and giving God glory by enjoying the humanness of my own life.
And we would recommend that you go away and find a copy of this and read it. But it's a really helpful reflection on why it's a good idea for you to continue to pursue study and to pursue learning, even in an uncertain world, in a world that doesn't necessarily look like it wants you to go and pursue study, and there might be lots of things in your life that might seem to be pulling you away from it. But don't consider study as something that's not relevant for a time like this. And that's, I think, something that Lewis is will help all of us to continue to reflect on, is the study is a legitimate pursuit. It's a good pursuit, and it's a pursuit where you can glorify God. You can know and love him better through it. And it's a way of you contributing to God's creation and to God's world as well. So it's been a good discussion, Ben. I've really enjoyed it, and we hope it's been helpful for you too.